And what happened in the case of Kenya was in the initial scheme, which was set up by the World Bank, of course, they funded a conservation scheme in the Embubot forest in Kenya, which is a territory, the home of a number of indigenous groups, including the Sengwer. And the Sengwer have lived there since time immemorial for thousands of years. And to cut a long story short, this conservation project was designed that didn't make any reference to indigenous rights to land, indigenous tenure, or anything like that. What happened was that this project assumed that all of the people in the forest, including the indigenous peoples, were squatters, that they were the drivers of deforestation, and they had to be removed from the forest. They had to be cleansed from the forest. And the money that the World Bank provided to fund this conservation scheme, a lot of it went to a government agency known as the Kenyan Forest Service. They literally, at gunpoint, on multiple occasions, burnt down the villages, forced the Sengwer people to leave, in an effort to remove them to make way for this project.
A spectre is haunting the globe in the 21st century. The spectre of ecological collapse. So the opening of this book by my friend Martin Crook, called Capitalism, Colonization. I got this wrong in the interview.
Just to correct you, it's Capitalism, Colonization, and the ecocide.
Fuck's sake.
I had to pull you up in the first 10 seconds.
I hate this cancel culture. Capitalism, Colonization, and the Ecocide Genocide Nexus is an effective consolidation of the themes and political direction of the work. It evokes the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, and Martin links the general ecological crisis of the 21st century with both capitalism and the only just fix to the climate collapse which haunts it: ecologically attuned communism. But Crook's book is not just another work which links ecological collapse to the tendencies inherent to capitalism. I wouldn't waste your time with arguments that are common at this point that you all know about, works from like John Bellamy Foster on the metabolic rift to the ever-growing degrowth literature. And I've done various videos on degrowth and ecology and green politics. But what's interesting and unique about Martin's book is that he argues that capitalism's inherent tendencies to commodify parts of the world pose a threat to all group life and must therefore be recognised as a primary driver of genocide. We're doing green politics and genocide in this video. A classic. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to dive a bit deeper into one specific context that Martin talks about in this book, which is the green governance of Kenyan conservationism. And I'm going to talk a bit about how conservation can itself be ecocidal and therefore genocidal, and in the context of effective altruists like William McCaskill rearing their heads again.
And so, off the back of that, I do expect that human beings will... I know this starts sounding like very sci-fi, but I think it's what follows if you really look at the arguments. I think at that point, they will start to be able to live indefinitely.
I want to point out how their market-based solutions and previous promotion of things like carbon credit systems have contributed to ecocide, have contributed to genocide. And full disclosure, this isn't hugely relevant, but I am just being petty here because I fucking hate those guys. If you've seen my effective altruism video, you'll know. I fucking hate those guys. Fucking fucking heirs to Jeremy Bentham and philanthropists like goddamn Andrew Carnegie colonizing the world with their massive egos and doing a bunch of weird shit with AI to make a bunch of money. I hate those guys. I am just being petty. But the important thing to get from this is that the reification of commodity logic, which has disrupted human ecological relations, is one of the central means through which ecocide and genocide happens. Oh, I've also got Martin here to talk about the book too. So say hi, Martin.
Hi. Yes, it is me.
Oh, right, that's enough for now. So throughout his book, Martin uncovers what he calls the political economy of genocide. That is, he locates the root of genocide within the structures of global economies and systems of government. Importantly, he seeks to integrate the essential role of ecology within this argument. And this isn't just to treat the environment as another additional factor which further contributes to genocidal impacts of global capitalism, but to treat the instrumentalization of ecology as a central aspect of capitalism's construction. And this draws attention to the genocidal results of profit-driven instrumentalizations of nature. Capitalism creates specific forms of regulation between humans and nature, severing any sense that we are ecologically embedded subjects, and instead imposes an understanding of nature as something easily quantified, easily altered, and turned into a tool for profit. And one clear example that Martin draws on later in the book is the ways in which neoliberal climate mitigation has turned carbon emissions into a quantifiable, tradable credit system.
And offsets are basically this idea where if you can invest in conservation projects that ostensibly are supposed to conserve ecosystems, the most famous example is, of course, the conservation of forests. Mm-hmm. That's where we see the REDD+ UN system. The premise is that if you can prove that you're doing that, then you can generate credits by virtue of slowing down deforestation and maybe even reversing it. So you're theoretically absorbing more carbon dioxide. So then you generate these credits, which can then be sold onto the original carbon markets, which are then bought by Western corporations, governments, and so on, which then allows them to basically not reduce carbon emissions at source and allow them to carry on business as usual, but still meet their obligations under international climate change treaties.
Instead of relating to nature through our inherent embeddedness within the Earth's systems, we understand it only through a relationship to it as commodities. In this case, carbon as a credit commodity. Other examples we could cite are things like ecotourism or even biodiversity conservation. Capitalism reframes nature as a commodity, and this way of relating humans to our ecology progressively overtakes, displaces, or subsumes alternative relations to the environment, which, especially for indigenous groups under settler colonial rule, has resulted in genocide. That is, Crook constructs an ecocide-genocide nexus.
Just by virtue of the fact that if you understand, if you sort of understand human beings as ecologically embedded, then it stands to reason that by destroying those ecosystems that support life, that can destroy groups as well. So for me, that's where the nexus lies. It's understanding that that essentially ecological destruction, ecocide being the most extreme manifestation of that, the sort of widespread, long-lasting and severe destruction of ecosystems, of course, could, in theory, lead to the destruction of a group. And so that's the ontological connection there. Yes.
To make his argument, Martin draws on the work of Raphael Lemkin, the author of the Genocide Convention, and pays particular attention to Lemkin's recognition of culture as a master concept for genocide. Cultural genocide was of course omitted from the Genocide Convention, from the legal understandings for various, political reasons. But as Crook makes clear, the destruction of a cultural genos, which is the living social cultural figuration of a social group, whether that destruction happened through land expulsions or assimilation or simply death, that is a central feature of genocide. And so Martin includes a ninth technique of genocide, the destruction of or severance from the ecosystem habitat of the group, to Lemkin's other 8, which are, and I'm going to go through them now, so get ready for a list, a genocide list. Is that good? That's not a good way to frame that. 1. Political involves the cessation of self-government and destruction of political institutions, followed by the imposition of administration by the colonial occupants. All local organisations are dissolved and imposition of parties of the occupant originating from the colonising power. The second, social, involves the annihilation of leadership, abolition of local courts. The third, cultural, involves the ban on the use of native language, the imposition of colonial education, and the rigid control of or restriction or prohibition of cultural activities like art, theatre, music, and so on. The fourth, which is economic, is the destruction of the foundations of economic existence. The fifth, biological, which is the interdiction of the reproduction of the group by decreasing the birth rate or the apprehension of the children and their assimilation into the group of the occupant. 6 is physical, which is of course the mass murder and endangering of health. 7, which is religious, is the disruption of religious influence, destruction of religious leadership as well. And the 8th, which is moral, creation of an atmosphere of moral debasement. So Martin adds a 9th to that, which is the ecological. And this argument contributes to a growing ecological turn within critical genocide studies and highlights the insufficiency of legalistic understandings of genocide which centre the role of intent as its determining feature.
He said there's a kind of bifurcated tradition within genocide studies where on the one hand you have the intentionalists or the sort of the liberal orthodoxy, which kind of adheres very closely to the legal definitions of genocide. So the UN Genocide Convention itself, which does have this requirement for intent, which does talk about, the destruction of groups as such, where it's necessary to establish, the guilty mind, mens rea, whatever term you want to use, where the group is destroyed because the perpetrators sought to destroy them because they are that group. In the colonial genocide studies tradition, as Dirk Moses described it, who employ a much more kind of structuralist understanding, a more sociologically informed understanding of genocide, which do, or sometimes referred to as the objectivists versus the subjectivists. So the subjectivists are those who fixate on intention. Objectivists are the structuralists who acknowledge the existence of external structures, can attribute genocide to largely macroeconomic and social structures, would not necessarily require that kind of proof of intent. And sometimes, as Tony Barter argued once in a beautiful essay he wrote, sometimes sort of fixating on that requirement is intentionally, pardon the pun, in order to sometimes conceal or render invisible actual genocides.
Because intent is so difficult to prove, completely.
Yeah, exactly. It's so difficult to prove, and it's if you go into the field of genocide studies, or more broadly human rights or whatever, or are you concerned about social justice? If you are an activist scholar, as I like to think of myself, then presumably you're more concerned with the opinions and experiences of the victims of atrocities, genocides, etc. And so you're more concerned about the effects, the consequences of actions. So it's sort of ultimately not that important whether the US Army intended to achieve a military victory or actually had genocidal intent. It's the consequences of their actions. Did they actually amount to genocide? Did it destroy the essential foundations of that group? This is something that exists objectively. Groups do really exist out there in the real world. They can be empirically observed. They're not just something, as some genocide scholars argue, like Chalk and Johannesson, who do kind of adhere to this more intentionalist view. Just the groups that are just sort of the figments of the imagination of the perpetrators. No, they actually exist objectively. And so we can verify through empirical observation whether genocide was achieved, regardless of what the actual intent of the perpetrators were.
Martin's view is clearly, for me, a much more analytically and politically productive perspective on genocide. Instead of focusing on what's going on in the minds of perpetrators, which they can hide and often do hide to avoid culpability, we instead focus on the genocidal impacts and experiences of those affected. To draw on an example beyond this book specifically, instead of being tied up in technical legal arguments about whether Israel really intends to kill Palestinians as such, we can clearly observe the destructive genocidal impacts of Zionism. And to illustrate his theoretical case, Crook draws on over 30 interviews in 2 different but connected case studies, Australia and Kenya. Each case presents slightly different manifestations of the colonial capitalist relation, but both highlight how, whether through marketized green governance in Kenya or through energy extractivism in Australia, capitalist development or developmentalism undermines the key relations between indigenous peoples and their ecological cultural existence. Capitalist colonial logics either subsume or eliminate indigenous relations to the land and replace them with capitalist or colonial market logics.
The imposition of the capitalist mode of production as an alien economic system on the Australian subcontinent, alien and also one that is inherently incompatible with indigenous lifeways, essentially meant that regardless of the particular motives, the particular intentions of individual colonists or colonial administrators, that system was going to, once it was, unleashed on the continent, destroy and erode the essential foundations of indigenous groups.
This full interview, by the way, is up for patrons now and will be up for everyone else in a few weeks. So if you want to see the full interview, go to my Patreon and have a wee look. We can get a deep dive into this book from the guy who wrote it. So to frame this conversation, I think it's useful to refresh our knowledge of the concept of genocide. And I've talked about this in several videos and given you this list earlier, but I think it is useful to have a wee refresher. So genocide exists well beyond the Genocide Convention. Over the past couple decades, there's been a rediscovery of sorts of Lemkin within critical genocide studies, which has foregrounded the clear connections between colonialism and genocide within Lemkin's major works and his notebooks.
And then I discovered in my research and reading that there were a few sort of examples of social scientists and historians trying to grapple with the idea that genocide could be something not just, the product of particular actors, genocidaires, but also something that can actually be a phenomenon that emerges out of society itself. And in particular, I'm sort of referring to people like the Australian historian Tony Barter, who coined the term relations of genocide. I found that fascinating. It immediately drew my eye when I read that for the first time, because of course it sort of resonates with Marx and Marx's sort of understanding of society, his analysis of the economic structure of all societies. In particular, of course, it's a kind of a play on the term relations of production. Anyway, so he was writing about Australia and arguing that the settler colonial society of Australia was inherently genocidal, that the society itself, not just particular individuals, not just the state, etc. And that I found quite fascinating.
So while the Genocide Convention excluded culture from the legal concept, the colonial turn has recentered culture as an essential force which ties together and animates certain social groups or a certain genus, a specific genus. For Lemkin and his post-liberal followers, genocide is the destruction of the collective culture which undermines the existence of the genus. And this is what is meant by the destruction of a people. Mass killing is a particularly violent expression of this process, and it would do the job, but it's far from the only way to do it. And so turning to ecology, all peoples, all of us, are embedded within diverse ecological relations, and this is just as true of non-Indigenous groups living in cities within the imperial core as it is Indigenous peoples in Australia or Kenya. I think there's a tendency sometimes to be like, oh, those people, they're so embedded in nature and we are not. We are embedded in nature. All of us are embedded in nature. You know, I might live in a city like London, which maybe seems distant from nature, you know, in big letters. But nature's not really a thing separate from us. It's part of what we do. We construct nature, or capital constructs nature. Various things construct nature in relation to us. So, for example, global warming has disrupted crop productions across the world, including for goods like coffee or sugar or basic crops. And this has driven food inflation across the world.
Climate change is disrupting food production and supply worldwide. Crops, fruit, livestock and transport are all affected. Permanently higher inflation may result, as well as food security threats.
So, my whole life in London appears far from intimately connected to world ecology, but is actually deeply dependent on it. But this dependence is just mediated through global market relations. My ecological relations have a specific form mediated by the market. They are only legible through commodities through the market. But for many groups who are at the sharp end of the ecocide-genocide nexus, the encroachment of market-mediated ecological relations is undermining core aspects of their cultural existence, disrupting the collective cultural reproduction of their genos and subjecting them to genocide.
The imposition of the capitalist mode of production as an alien economic system, that system was going to destroy and erode the essential foundations of indigenous groups.
So in Martin's book, he zooms in on a couple of different cases to demonstrate this. The encroachment of energy extractivism in Aboriginal Australian land and the green conservationism or conservatism, or what we could call market environmentalism in Kenya. And we're going to focus on the latter case. Kenya is, of course, still deeply scarred by the history of British colonialism. Between 1952 and 1963, the British imprisoned around 1.5 million Kenyans in concentration camps in retaliation against the Kenyan anti-colonial liberation movement, which launched a guerrilla war against the British occupiers.
The British took land away from Kenyans and introduced forced labour. 50 years later, when some Kenyans began to revolt, the British began a brutal military campaign that included detention camps and torture.
These concentration camps were, I guess it will be unsurprising to learn, filled with torture and death, which is still yet to be fully uncovered as the British state continues to obfuscate details.
Britain still does not accept that it is legally liable for its actions under the colonial administration.
But since Britain began its withdrawal in 1963, Kenya has not really broken through of colonialism, but rather the dynamic has shifted into neocolonialism. And this is something that we can clearly see through contemporary green market investment. For example, Martin points out in his book that the formerly EU-funded Water Tower Protection and Climate Change Migration and Adaptation Project, or WATER project, which was suspended in 2018 after pushback from human rights organisations, utilised techniques characteristic of green neo-colonial land grabbing to clear the Mau forests of the indigenous Sengwer people who lived in and whose cultural genos was dependent on their connection to that forest. These clearances resulted in the killing of indigenous activist Robert Kirotich and the violation of the Sengwer people's right to their ancestral lands. And while the Kenyan government justified the expulsion of the Sengwer on environmental conservationist grounds, they framed the Sengwer as criminals, as loggers, as poachers.
And what happened in the case of Kenya was, in the initial scheme, which was set up by the World Bank, of course, they funded a conservation scheme in the Embubot forest in Kenya, which is a territory, the home of a number of indigenous groups, including the Sengwer. And the Sengwer lived there since time immemorial for thousands of years. And to cut a long story short, this conservation project was designed that didn't make any reference to indigenous rights to land, indigenous tenure, or anything like that. There's no reference to even the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent. What happened was that this project assumed that all of the people in the forests, including the indigenous peoples, were squatters, that they were the drivers of deforestation, and they had to be removed from the forest. They had to be cleansed from the forest. And the money that the World Bank provided to fund this conservation scheme, a lot of it went to a government agency known as the Kenyan Forest Service. They literally, at gunpoint, on multiple occasions, burnt down the villages, forced the Sengwer people to leave, in an effort to remove them to make way for this project.
It is clear that the expulsions, the village destructions, and the killings were done to secure access to the land. Full villages were burnt down to secure access to this land. And this was far from an isolated example. As Martin points out, the World Bank had previously funded a conservation and carbon offset program called REDD+, which similarly resulted in mass evictions of Sengwer communities from their ancestral lands, which thereby severed or attempted to sever the ecological relations which are essential to the cultural life of the Sengwer as a group. This green market-based colonialism, which was trying to grab this land to expel the local people and to create areas of conservation, of water conservation, of green conservationism, was actively genocidal. But the further dimension of this genocidal severing of ecological relations was the transformation of those relations into an ecology defined by its mediation through the market. Martin points to the Kenyan Water Towers Agencies, or the KWTA, which reframed the forest not as something that was essential to the cultural existence of specific groups, but as a location of a wide variety of values of this ecosystem, which diversifies revenue streams by capitalising on ecosystem values, thereby maximising both conservationism and economic returns on investment. And so we can see here the increasing reformation of ecological relations through the reification of ecology of the forest as a commodity. And so the impact of this commodification of nature is that instead of understanding humans and nature as one interconnected whole, nature is reconstructed and fragmented into smaller and smaller parcels, which can be understood as discrete commodities for sale for exchange on the market. And this is what allows nature to be forcibly abstracted into a set of equal values which can be traded, making possible things like carbon credit trading.
It's fascinating because it means, just like with all commodities, as Marx argues in Capital, it is based on or predicated on the quantitative kind of homogenization and the making of the real world into a kind of commensurate, tradable, exchangeable thing. Mm-hmm. Which is only understood by its value, right? Mm-hmm. By its price.
And you'll think about it. You can only believe that trading carbon credits is an effective climate mitigation process if you understand nature as being constructed of various identical blocks, such that destroying one can be made up by investing in another. And in the case of the Kenyan Sengwer, Martin points out that the World Bank's REDD+ program, which evicted Sengwer people from their land, did so to produce red carbon credit offsets. In the name of green market conservationism, the Sengwer were subject to ecocidal genocide, which disrupted their ecological connection to the land and imposed upon them a commodified neo-colonial market relation.
There is a sort of, as I go into in the book, a kind of tragic, there's a sort of dark side to conservationism in that sense, because for the Kenyan government and the conservation projects sponsored by first the World Bank, then the EU and Norway, were still predicated on this kind of racial spatialization. I say spatialization because it depended on various techniques of mapping and so on, that kind of reconstitute, socially constructed nature, reconstructed nature in a fashion that rendered, it removed the history of indigenous embeddedness in these places. It removed their co-evolution. The socio-ecological relations had to be redrawn and restructured to facilitate their removal and their concentration onto reservations and so on. And that continues to this day in these conservation projects.
And of course, it's not new that conservationism has been used to evict and destroy indigenous access to lands. There's long histories from across North America, from Canada, from the US, across Latin America and South America and Brazil and other places to create national parks to frame the local people as a threat to the environment, to this sort of pristine ideal of the environment that should be, non-encroached upon. And the ideal of conservationism, of national parks, has been used through many different contexts to expel people.
Out with my family harvesting, and we ran into a park ranger who yelled at us because they said we weren't harvesting in the right area. Been here since our creator put us here, unlike other tribes that were forcibly removed, passing that knowledge on from generation to generation.
But what's happening here, and what is, I think, unique in this particular kind of relation, is that it's conserved but also marketized. And this is the kind of neoliberal dimension to this particular current moment of ecocidal genocide relations. And so it's here that we can return to the often quoted line from Lemkin in his book Access Rule in Occupied Europe. Genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition in turn may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after the removal of the population and the colonisation of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. In this case, the national pattern of the Sengwer is destroyed, while the national, or indeed the international, neo-colonial pattern of global capital is imposed. And I just wanted to point out that in cases like this, it just becomes so clear just how impoverished visions of do-goodery proposed by capitalist philanthropic ventures like the effective altruists are. Not only did EA previously promote carbon credits as a super effective way to do philanthropy, thereby actively contributing to the global system of ecocide genocide, but as they continue to operate through market mechanisms, they continue to support a way of engaging with social and environmental life which forces the world into a capitalist commodity logic, which requires the fragmentation and alienation of the world so that the value of each block of good can be easily compared against the value of another via this sort of universal equivalent form of value, money. And, once again, I'm being a bit petty here because, I hate these tech bro suit freaks.
And so off the back of that, I do expect that human beings will... I know this starts sounding like very sci-fi, but I think it's what follows if you really look at the arguments. I think at that point they will start to be able to live indefinitely.
But I do think it's a relevant example to bring up just how the ecocide genocide nexus is part of a comprehensive world logic which can sometimes be difficult to spot.
So it is the case that businesses are making money from carbon trading and offsets, which is...
Conservationism, it's not just useless, but actively harmful.
Is actively harmful, and it sort of accelerates, actually, the climate crisis.
And, I do think it's also worth it to point out that not only did these effective altruists, through their mathing, not understand, not figure out for a while that carbon credits were useless, but they were actively harmful. They were actively genocidal. So effective altruists, I do want to be clear on this, were promoting an ecocidal, genocidal process as a means of doing effective philanthropy. And I think that's an important failure on their part. But I digress. One thing which I think should be forefronted in the discussion of groups like the Sengwer is that, like, a really, really important feature of this, which Martin gets into and which he demonstrates, is that the agency of indigenous groups and the alliances forged between them and segments of the settler working class have at times produced moments of resistance. And Martin points out that the Sengwer resistance has forestalled the total destruction of their ecological national pattern. You know, for example, the EU's water project was suspended in 2018. It was suspended because of resistance, because of connections and building out collective power against this. And victories like this are an essential reminder that while capitalism is a monster on the warpath, its course can be changed. It can be slain by the collective power of those it seeks to consume. Capitalism is a monster. Its appetite is insatiable and its footprint's massive. And by highlighting the genocide-ecocide nexus, Crook demonstrates the power of capitalism to destroy whole peoples. But by grounding the work in those resisting its power, we're reminded that, in the words of Ursula Le Guin, its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Alright, thanks for watching. As ever, please remember to like, subscribe, check your subscriptions, and if you can, share this video. I have a suspicion that the YouTube algorithm has changed to be more like TikTok and really only recommend content that has been recently watched, which obviously negatively impacts people who take some time to create and upload videos on a less frequent basis, which is probably not great for producing good, well-researched content, but I've seen my views collapse. So if you like this, please give it a share and a like and all that shite. We'd really appreciate it. Also, thanks to Martin Crook, Dr. Martin Crook, for being part of this video. Go to the description, you'll find a link to an open access copy of his book, which you can download. You can also buy physical copies anywhere, Amazon, or through the link posted above in the description. And yeah, thanks for watching again. Let me know also if this kind of format of having some people come in and talk, give interviews, is something that you guys would like to see more of. It was quite fun doing this first one with Martin. We've been friends for a long time, so it was easy to get it started that way. For anyone who wants to sign up to Patreon, you get early access to videos. Patrons can see the full interview with Martin right now, and so can channel members. And and you also get a number of perks at different levels. $5 and up patrons get access to a Discord server, and $10 and up get their names read out in the credits, which I will do just now. So thanks to Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Sovel Hayes, Anita Anisby, Bonbon, Cameron Blakemore, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Ellis Wren, FD Signifier, Hey Joe, Joshua Moldenhauer, Kim Crawley, Nina G Public Relations, S, Tom Hutton, Unoriginal Name, Ugga Ghost, Aaron, Alex, Barney Carroll, Kate Soiree, Christopher Poff, Daniel Hughes, Duncan Skinner, Esoteric Fictionalism, Eugene K, J Fraser Cartwright, Jack, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Joel, Caspar Gunda Westber Larson, Kieran Gore, Layum, Mason Colbert, Melanie Estes, Morgussi, Nelly Zacheva, Niels Ambelgard, Paul Singleton, Via Westphal, Richard Ann, Rachel Mixon, Robin, Tamash Kispeter, TB Skyen, Tim, Tinfoil Pancakes, Tom Price, and Xander Corvus. Alright, and that is it for today. Thanks again for watching. As ever, like and blah 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 blah. Whatever. Love you. Bye.
this new system, which eventually actually gets abandoned by the American government. Ironically, they leave this legacy. They piss on everyone's chips and then bugger off. And then the
Is
European
that a phrase?
It is now.